please join us in the spirit of meditation, reflection, or prayer as we deepen into our service and share our opening words for this morning by the writer Leslie Marmon Silko. Then they grow away from the earth, then they grow away from the sun, then they grow away from the plants and the animals. They see no life. When they look, they see only objects. The world is a dead thing for them. The trees and the rivers are not alive, and the mountains and stones are not alive, and the deer and bear are objects. They see no life. They fear the world, they destroy what they fear themselves. We gather this morning to remind ourselves to embrace life and to be courageous. We gather in this time of uncertainty, full of unknowns, as angst closes in upon us. We light this chalice with the flame that draws us together. With this flame, we cut through the darkness of isolation and are warmed by the fires of our interconnection. For this moment, this radical moment, we find a certainty within the noble bonds of love and community. And now a story for all ages.
So our story this morning is a Greek story. And a long time ago, when the world was still so new that it had a sheen on it, the gods were looking at the earth that they just created. And they suddenly realized they had made a terrible mistake. They had made all the people they created men. And they thought, oh my, how boring is that? And the gods themselves were very diverse. There were tall ones and short ones and wide ones and narrow ones. Some had long dark hair, some had curly red hair. Some were men, some were women, and some were a little bit of both. So they thought, well, we've got to do something about this. And they thought about, one of them was their Aphrodite. And they thought, let's create another kind of human that's like our sister Aphrodite. And Aphrodite is the goddess of love. So they thought, we will make this new kind of human full of love and goodness and kindness and generosity. We'll put all the good things into her. So they created her and they called her Pandora. And they thought, we'll give Pandora a special job. We're going to put her in charge of everything that is the opposite of her. So they found a jar, a clay jar, and they filled it with evil and hatred and jealousy and despair and anger and all those bad things. And they stuffed them in the jar and they put in a big cork and then they sealed it with wax and then they wrapped it with duct tape. And then they gave it to Pandora and they said, take this with you to Earth, but don't ever, ever, ever open it. So she took it with her and she stuck it in a corner of her new home. And for a while, she was so busy learning how to be a person and how to be alive and how to be on Earth that she never thought about the jar. But every once in a while, she'd see it out of the corner of her eye and think about it a little bit. And as time went on, she thought about it more and more and more. And she thought, well, I'll just take a little peek. That won't hurt anything. So what do you think? Should she take a little peek? So one day she decided she would do it, and she took off the duct tape and she chipped off the wax and she opened it just a crack, but that was enough. All the evil in the world was released. All the suffering and despair and anger and jealousy and hatred was loose in the world. And she did everything she could think of to try to get it all back in the jar, but it was too late. It was out there. And she sat there feeling pretty awful and wondering what she should do. And she noticed that there was still one more thing in the jar making a little sound. And she peeked again, and it was hope. And she released hope into the world. So if hope can live with all those bad things in a jar, surely it can live in our hearts. This past summer, the Reverend Jill McAllister and I had a conversation sermon about the Buddhist idea of the Brahma Viharas, or the 4 best homes for the mind. And one of those homes is equanimity. In our conversation, I noted equanimity is important because life is ambiguous. Amongst other things, we live knowing that we will die, and not just that we will die, but that everyone we love will die as well. She responded with the observation that there is loss, but that we are held in a bigger love. And I've been chewing on that ever since. Are we? Are we held in a bigger love? I like that idea, that love exists on a cosmic scale and that we are held in that love. But I honestly can't quite get there. If you can, if you have some assurance that we are held in something larger, I'm so glad for you. And I hope that that is serving you well in these chaotic times. I've been talking a lot lately about how we need to be grounded, deeply grounded, in light of the realities of injustice, political upheaval, climate crisis, and a pandemic, not to mention all our personal and unique challenges. And perhaps I'm talking about it so much because while I recognize the need, I've not entirely worked out that grounding for myself. It seems important that we do that. It seems like a primary role of religion to help ground you in the tumult of life. Paul Tillich was a Christian theologian, and he envisioned God as the ground of being, which puts a different spin on the question, where do you ground your life? One website explains his ground of being theology like this. Paul Tillich was critical of the view of God as a type of being or a presence. He felt that if God were a being, God could not then properly be called the source of all being, due to the question of what in turn created God. As an alternative, he suggested that God be understood as the ground of being itself. He felt that since one cannot deny that there is being where we and our world exist, there is therefore a power of being. He saw God as the ground upon which all beings exist. As such, God precedes being itself, and God is manifested in the structure of beings. So I'm not a Tillich scholar, and I'm not sure why theologians and philosophers can't speak a little more plainly. So I may be misunderstanding, but I believe Tillich was rejecting the idea of God as a being, like a heavenly father, and God as an essence, like God is love or the force. Instead, he offered a notion of God as the ground upon which everything exists, or God is simply being. Wikipedia elaborates a view of God as being itself, the ground of being, and the power of being, one in which God is beyond existence and essence. It's hard to wrap your head around God as being, not God as a person or God as a force, just being. I find I have to leave off the word ground or I get too literal. God as being. It's fun, however, to play with where you ground yourself and how that might intersect with Tillich's notion of God, that is the ground of being. We may have to unpack this a little more in our Curiosity Guild. Meanwhile, I've figured out a few of the places I find grounding and offer them to you as a starting place for you to think about what grounds you. Those of you who have come to know me know that nature is pretty central in my own religious life. Dirt Church will always be my first spiritual home. My children were conceived, born, and raised in 3 different states, and not entirely the same states as one another. I joke that they were born to nomads. It's interesting to me, though, that they both ended up in Colorado. Colorado is where I was born, and definitely my spiritual home. I roam, but I always return. In Judaism, the children are raised with the mother's religion. I think maybe it isn't an accident that they live there. I had opportunity to be in my beloved Colorado mountains this past summer. I would be out there as alone as you can get in Colorado, just me and another 200 people on my hike. But there were stretches of solitude. And it isn't always nice. Sometimes I think I go to the wilds just to see if I can come to the floor of existential loneliness. If I can find the bottom, the way out will be made clear to me. On this trip, however, I sat in the mountains and tried on being held in a greater love. No dice. The best I could authentically own was that I was part of something. I was part of something huge and beautiful and timeless, not unchanging, but timeless. Honestly, it doesn't seem quite as nourishing as being held in love, but it was pretty good. I read a book a long time ago called The World Without Us. The author, Alan Weisman, starts with the imaginary premise that human beings all die off suddenly and entirely. Then he looks at what would happen to all of our infrastructure. If I remember correctly, he thought oil refineries might ignite and burn for a long time, which would be awful for the environment. And I'm sure there were some other lingering effects of humanity. On the other hand, he was shocked to learn how quickly our artifacts would disappear. He also noted that other species would quickly move in again. Perhaps a little misanthropically, the book filled me with peace. It comforted me to know that life would go on. So that is one place you might ground yourself. Life is tenacious. The call to life is a siren song in our heads. Life yearns for life, drives toward more life, survives catastrophe and horror, and clings to life. Our drive towards life is hardwired into us and very powerful. Life endures even when we're gone. And I find this to be grounding. But I can't say that it gives me a lot of strength when the chips are down. It does not have the same power as believing there is a greater love or a God that has our backs. I'm forced into a much more mundane grounding for my life, the here and now, and the reality that my five senses can describe for me. In the here and now, we have beauty, and unless I'm consorting with existential loneliness a little too deeply, a walk or a hike in nature can usually shift my perspective. Robert Frost's poem often comes to mind. The way a crow shook down on me, the dust of snow from a hemlock tree, has given my heart a change of mood and saved some part of a day I had rued. I can be swimming around in my fear for my country, in my shame, in my inadequacy, in my grief, and then there is a frog. And for the next 20 minutes, my brain is only frog. Frog has the power to pull me out of my busy little monkey mind and into beauty. Or there is a mountain lake, or a cornice of snow, or a pattern in the sand, or a baby's foot, or a little stinky weasel. And beauty takes over my mind. Emerson said, "The earth laughs in flowers." And this immersion into beauty is often followed by a rush of gratitude. What a gift to be alive on such a beautiful planet. The poet Mary Oliver says, "I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention." Implying, of course, that paying attention is a prayer. I go into nature then and I pay attention with every fiber of my being, and it seems a good spiritual practice. I mentioned gratitude following beauty. Gratitude is another excellent grounding force. We're so often caught up in what we don't have and what we need and what we dislike that we forget to notice all that we do have. Humans engage in different sorts of bias, and one is a negativity bias. We are designed to be vigilant for danger. It keeps the species viable. We are prey as well as predator. But that attention to danger can run amok. Many people have a spiritual practice of simply paying attention to what they are grateful for, naming it out loud or writing it down, and this is a daily spiritual practice. If you are looking for things to be grateful for, you'll find them. Gratitude has the power to reorient your life. Another place where I worship is at the altar of stories. I love the written word, fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. I love oral storytelling. Most of us don't have much access to the stories of our ancestors that we once did. And we may see stories that are told over and over as a sign of dementia rather than a pattern of shared oral history and instruction for life. But we still tell stories, and podcasts like The Moth or The Story let us borrow the stories of others, their lived experience. And through poetry, our deepest truths are distilled into a few lines. Stories don't have to be true, however, to be true. The novelist Neil Gaiman says, fiction gives us empathy. It puts us inside the minds of other people, gives us the gifts of seeing the world through their eyes. Fiction is a lie that tells us true things over and over. Stories help us to widen the circle of our concern. If I've had a moment dwelling in the abode of your mind, we can hardly be strangers anymore. We are connected. We share a moment of compassion and empathy. Stories foster connection and help us to know that we are not actually the only alien on the planet. That connection can help to ground us. Which brings me to perhaps the most grounding power of all, our lived connections with one another. Have you ever been in a low place and felt like you did not have the energy even to be with other people? It's just time for the fetal position and not thinking anymore, and then the phone rings, and you don't want to answer, but there is some decision-making calculus that tells you not answering will only make things harder. You might have to muster the energy to initiate a return call after all. So you grudgingly say hello. And little by little, you are pulled into a conversation. When you hang up, you realize you are no longer in that terrible place. It was just that easy. Sometimes we don't need the cosmic everything will be okay and life has a purpose. We just need a conversation. Sometimes we don't even need the conversation. We just need the hug. It is enough to be held in imperfect love by just one finite human being. It is enough. And the connection doesn't necessarily even have to be between two humans. A cat curled on your chest purring can be pretty grounding as well. The wind finding you in a pandemic lockdown city can ground you. Our relationships matter. I think all these experiences, all these ways of being grounded, point to the transcendent. And there is another word that repels many of us. I think we associate the transcendent with the supernatural and with escape, or it seems like a feature of a faith that is not our own. But in this context, to transcend is just to make a connection outside of yourself, to belong to something bigger for a little bit. Maybe to belong to a greater love, or maybe to belong to beauty, or to share another person's experience, or to be loved by another person. For a moment, you do not end at your epidermis. You are part of the interconnected web of all existence. These ordinary moments of transcendence, of belonging, can ground us. So where do you find the kind of moments of grounding or connection that steady you when you most need it? This is not a rhetorical question. If you are comfortable sharing, I would invite you now to turn on your camera and your mic and share some of what connects and grounds you in this life. And not the pretty but empty words of what should ground you, but what actually works for you. So I would invite you to comment.
Hey, this is Marnie, and I'm glad to share. The weird thing that grounds me is rearranging my furniture and just repurposing and making my space beautiful and new to look at. It just sort of makes me feel home.
Hi, this is Pat. Being outside grounds me, makes me feel good. I'm sitting outside right now. It's a little chilly on my feet, but it's so nice. I'm watching squirrels and looking at the changing leaves and the garden changing, and it just makes me happy.
Good morning, this is CJ. What has grounded me in the immediate, in the past week, it has been arranging my my walks so that I go by all the beautiful bushes and trees that are turning red. It's just such a soulful, lovely experience.
I'll share, because course grounding, quote unquote, is such a big part of like the work I do and for clients and trying to connect their energy to the earth and connect their energy to heaven and fix them up. And I need to ground when I'm doing that kind of stuff, but I definitely feel the connection with you all, and it's something I've started to take for granted, the familiarity I have with who's on this call, and so I feel that as a ground, this sense of community and this connection here, and the reminder to just engage with your physical space and move things or make a good meal, and that's grounding too. Shut off the TV, shut off the input, and just like pay attention what's going on right here.
Many things, relationships, but particularly the ridiculously twisted and long-running inside jokes that my family and I have, from Quinn back to my dad. It's just such a funny little inside spider web of connectivity that it always, when I really take the time to think about it, it gives me great joy.
Good morning, everybody. This is Mary. My video is not that great right now, but I'm joining from Vermont. I'm in the house that I grew up in, and I haven't been here in October in, I think, 11 years, which I hadn't really realized until I got here. And the trees turning all around are just gorgeous. I knew this, but being in it has been really powerful and beautiful and grounding, and as has stacking firewood.
For me, it's hearing my grandson's voice tell me that he's always on my side and that he wishes that I was there with him right now. And also when I am outdoors in my garden and look at the beauty that I have around me and being with my family.
Sorry. And thinking about this question of how I find grounding, I was surprised by the number of ways that came to mind. And some of the biggest ones, certainly conversations with my siblings, relationships, this fellowship, and then also exercise, doing things like walking or doing something like that. But the walking part doesn't always work, but I often give it a try anyway.
I would say being with dogs is very grounding. They are such simple creatures, and it makes us wonder, why are we so complicated? Why does everything have to be so complicated? So hanging out with a dog, going for a walk, watching them enjoy every sniff along the way, embrace the moment. It's a good reminder for us.
Of course, I'll echo the nature theme that everyone has, especially being out in the national park. But one of the things that grounds me, and especially this summer, has been gravel roads. I've spent a lot of time walking on them and running on them, and actually meeting in very odd ways, meeting people around here. So gravel roads have grounded me this summer.
Doing this. I was happy to talk to Marnie this morning, and she said she was coming to church, so I thought, oh, I'll go too. And I feel that interconnected web, and that feels great. And last night I helped with the civil rights sing-along at the UU church here. And I participated in my mother-in-law's 85th birthday party via Zoom. and I teach yoga online, and I'm connecting with people in those ways and helping my kids with their school stay connected so many ways. And so it's a joy to be here. It's great to see your names and your faces. And
Right, thank you, everyone. I always think there's no difference between the sacred and the mundane, and I think that's evident here. We find sacred space in all kinds of places.
Anyone with eyes to see